Good morning. This is Rick Kite with the D.B. Reinhardt Institute for Ethics and Leadership. Our program is Ethics Today, and we've been interviewing people from different walks of life to try to give us a better perspective on what's going on in our society. As we grow up, we learn kind of norms of ethical conduct and ways of ethical reasoning that help guide us through much of life. But when we live in such a complex world with ever-changing technology, a lot of that guidance doesn't operate that well anymore. And so we see this especially with what's going on with media, like who do we trust and who don't we trust? So our guest today is Frank Oswald, who is a faculty member in Columbia University's Strategic Communications program, and he teaches a course on communication ethics and persuasion. So Frank, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Rick. I can't think of anything more important right now.
You have such an interesting background because you started in corporate communications. You were working on Wall Street, and then you make the shift into academics where you're teaching and researching communication ethics and persuasion, right? How persuasion works.
Yeah, I think that makes me quite an oddball, Rick. I'm really the accidental ethicist, and couldn't be happier about it. So my undergraduate degree is from your state, it's from the University of Wisconsin, but I wanted to follow in the footsteps of Woodward and Bernstein in the age of Watergate and become the next world famous investigative reporter. But I lacked one thing, which was really the talent to do it. So that kind of pushed me over to the dark side, and I was recruited by more of the marketing side of communications, and where I've spent the last 40 years. So the last 40 years of my career have been in marketing and corporate communications, mostly in advertising and in PR and in branding. And that included a stint, like you said, working for financial giants in 2007 and 2008 that really triggered the global financial crisis. And that really hit me hard. That was a real awakening where I had to think, wait a minute, was I complicit in this? Do I have some responsibility in this matter? And I took time back then, and I'm in my late 40s at that time, to rethink my own career. At the same time, things like Twitter and Facebook were just starting to get some traction, and I thought it would be a good time to go back to school and retool. I was lucky to find the Columbia Strategic Communication program at the right time, and somewhere during the course of that, they had the crazy idea that I should teach this stuff too. So after I graduated, they invited me on to be part of their adjunct faculty, where I've been for the last 10 years. 5 years ago, one of our faculty members left for another university and opened up a slot for an ethics instructor. And I thought, here's my opportunity. Here's my opportunity to take what my conscience felt way back in 2007 and 2008 to look at the power that the new tools of persuasion have really brought to the ability to change people's behaviors and to bring them together in the study of communications ethics. And as you mentioned a minute ago, it's a great bookend right now. I teach classes in persuasion. I also teach classes in communications ethics, and those two are at constant struggle. And that's what I'm doing today, Rick. That was kind of a lengthy introduction, but
Well,
I hope that gives you some context, right? I am definitely the accidental ethicist, so that's the perspective that I can help bring to your series.
well, that's great. And one of the things I really like about what your background is you started out in communication, really studying journalism, and then working in
Absolutely.
communications at a time when the traditional media had a lot of power, and it shaped opinions and attitudes and so forth. But at the same time, we didn't hear a lot about journalistic ethics in the time when traditional media had a lot of power. We hear a lot about it now, but we also have much more influence from social media, it seems to me, than traditional media in many respects.
Well, I think that's true. And in fact, the latest Pew research shows that 58% of people now get their news from social media, and that's up, I think it's roughly 8% over last year. And at the same time, social media, the rise of social media over the last decade has had a tremendous impact in reducing the number of people who are reporting at traditional newspapers or news sources. And then the third factor you have, Richard, is that it's the economic model means that you need to have clicks. And so even the face of journalism itself has changed because that which gets clicked on gets rewarded. So those three factors have changed the face of many things, but the way that we get information and the kind of information that we get and the power of social media itself has changed the entire environment.
Right. Well, if what really drives much reporting now, and even posting, say on social media, is the number of clicks, that really gives an incentive to really short, kind of superficial coverage of things, because it is rare for somebody to read a long story in, say, in a newspaper or a journal anymore, or even to watch a long, say, a full-length documentary.
No, and it's not in the financial interest of social media to have you do anything but stay on their site and to keep scrolling as quickly as you can. So it's not uncommon for people to scan headlines and to share things without even having read them, right?
Right.
So we'll react emotionally, and I think that's one of the most important things for everyone to understand about what social media has created is it's created an emotional medium for the delivery of rational news. And if you just think back to classic, that's my hometown alarm signal. Is that coming through on your?
Yeah, I can hear it in
Yeah.
the background there. So are you in Manhattan right now?
I'm not. I'm about 12 miles up the river, 12
Okay.
miles north of Manhattan, but 29 minutes into Midtown. And it's a village where we still have a volunteer fire and rescue department, and so that horn is probably going to sound one more time, totally ruining
No,
your video
no,
search,
no, no, no.
which I apologize for. But it'll give everyone a taste of what it's like living on the Hudson River, which is right here over my shoulder. This idea of being an emotional environment is really important to social media because what it wants us to do is to stay engaged. And right now, based on research last year, the average user of social media, which is now, depending on your estimate, about 60 to 65% of people, are now online an average of nearly 2.5 hours. And so, what social media wants us to do, because they monetize our views and monetize our engagement, is to heighten our emotional state. That's why there are likes. That's why we love things. That's why you can say it's wow. That's why you can say I'm angry. And that emotional state, if you think back just to kind of classical going back to rhetoric and Aristotle, if you take things like logos and ethos and pathos, and if you think about them all on an equal footing, okay, it makes sense. So logos being reason, ethos being the character of the speaker, and pathos being the emotional state of the audience. People think of it as emotion, as in the emotional content of the message, but it's really the emotional state of the message of the audience. What happens if I can heighten the emotional state of the audience? In fact, by doing so, I can mute reason. And that is even more important today, Richard, when you think about the power of micro-targeting audiences, because if I can bring people into an emotional environment, which is what social media has become, and then I can micro-target people who are most influenced, I can mute their reason. And that is one of the most important things that's going on right now, especially relative to things like the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, so this idea of heightening emotional states
Correct.
in science. So the one of the questions that people are asking is why does false information spread so quickly? And what you're suggesting here, it's not really that the problem isn't the gatekeepers. Like, see, that's one suggestion, is that in traditional media we had these gatekeepers who would kind of figure out like what's true and what's false, and this was part of kind of the journalistic ethics and responsibilities and so forth. It's really that we diminish our own powers of discernment when we are engaging with certain kinds of media both quickly and in a heightened emotional state. And so that we're more likely to pass on false information because we ourselves as consumers are not really paying attention to it in the proper way.
Attention's the right word. Attention is exactly what this, what social media is driven by. So they have kidnapped our attention. There's a limited amount of attention that we have. And when you think about it, 10 years ago, social media was a blip. I mean, Twitter didn't even exist until 2007, 2008. And it wasn't really until 2009, 2010 that both Facebook and Twitter became more of a force in society. So in one decade, we've gone from social media commanding none of our attention to almost 2.5 hours. Now, a lot of that time that people spend on social media is also concentrated time. So that if I can actually keep you in an emotional state for a longer period of time,
Right.
that's going to mute that reason more and more and more. So it's not a fault of it's not a fault of people who, um, whether occasionally we'll say we'll take out malicious spread of false information. We'll just talk about people who accidentally or unwittingly spread misinformation. It's because we're human. And there was a study that backs up a lot of this from 3 researchers at MIT, published in Science in 2018, so recent. And it showed that false information spreads to 1,500 people 6 times faster than truth. And when they dissected it, they looked at things like false information had more novelty. False information was propelled more by things like fear. False information was propelled by things like disgust. So there's this idea of something being surprising, something that might elicit more emotion like fear, but then at the same time, if it now helps reinforce my worldview or the worldview I've come to accept, then I'm going to be more eager to share it. And that's when the networking effect of social media really kicks in. Because once I see enough shares, I begin to believe anything is true because in my environment, I see it replicated. So the
So
truth that's in my feed or my environment is totally different than the truth of someone else's social feed or environment.
So it seems we've got 3 things working together there. First of all, you've got a heightened emotion state, which is sort of
Exactly.
diminishing my own capacity at reasoning carefully.
Absolutely.
You've got social norming. So I've got all my friend network and all my friends are believing this. So I'm more inclined to believe it without bringing a critical eye to it. And then the other thing, we've got confirmation bias. So I know I'm more likely to believe the things that support my own worldview, right? And
Yeah,
so
you have selection bias and you also have confirmation bias. And that confirmation bias goes to another extent where I am now going to take the same information and I'm going to filter it to my truth. An example this morning would be that the state of Mississippi, after having a measured opening of the state, has had an uptick in both COVID cases and also in COVID deaths. Okay, so that is a fact. That is a fact. But now my confirmation bias, if I am on the side that says we need to keep social distancing and need to have more control, says, look, there's proof of what's happening here. As soon as you open things up too fast, more people are going to die, we're going to have more issues. But there's a confirmation bias on the other side too that says, hell, wait a minute, Mississippi is now doing more testing and Mississippi is now uncovering more of these conditions. And frankly, if you also look at it, Mississippi's healthcare system is still got 90% capacity to be able to take on any of these kinds of cases. So we can even take things that are facts and then start to filter them through our confirmation biases to mean something that we want them to mean. And that is a real problem. And if I continue to be in an environment where I only see the things that my friends who share similar points of view, it reassures me that I'm on the right track. There's another aspect of it, which is, if you think about, again, going back to classics and things like Socratic dialogue. Social media is not a Socratic dialogue. It is a conflict place. It is not a place of comparing ideas and facts and opinions. It's become a place of taking sides. And so if something doesn't agree with what I have on my side, you're also going to get people put up blinders or defenses. That's a really complicated thing, but I don't think it's because people don't want to think. I, what's happening more is that we've just become susceptible to our own human quality. And over the last 15 or 20 years, as a result of our dependence on the internet and our need to get quick answers, we're also diminishing the need to think, not in a real sense, but in the sense of being able to solve problems quickly. So we don't want to think. It's
Right.
you think about what Daniel Kahneman wrote about in Thinking Fast and Slow, and it's like when we were faced with a difficult decision, we'll often default to the easy one, but the second part of that is without even knowing it
Right.
without even
Right.
knowing it.
Right.
And so it's a cycle that is reinforcing itself. And I'm sure you see that too in working with students, that students have just the same capacity as ever to think. And when you bring students into a classroom and invite thinking, I mean, the conversations, discussions are incredibly invigorating. But if I put them into another environment where thinking is not what's valued, and in fact, I'm going to stimulate your emotional response with a dopamine hit every time someone hits a like or a love, boy, it kidnaps that ability. It mutes it, and we don't know it. And I think that's the real issue, Richard.
So this is, I want to talk about, like, what do we do about it? You brought up how social media is not a Socratic dialogue.
No.
Socrates claimed that if we're going to live an ethical life, the most important thing is getting at the truth, and you do that by both questioning and being questioned. You have to allow yourself to be questioned, and so this is something we don't do very willingly on social media. What do we do given this environment? Because this is hugely important for our society, and I think if we're going to have a healthy democracy, um, we as citizens, we have responsibilities for making informed decisions about who we elect, what policies we weigh in on, and so forth, how we weigh in on them. So how do we act responsibly in this current environment?
Yeah, I think that's the critical question, and certainly the one that everyone's trying to get their arms around. If I can wear my persuasion hat for a minute, there's something called the information deficit model, which goes by the fallacious idea that if we can just get our information out there, we will persuade or convince people. But I think more than ever, people can take a step back from that now and understand that information deficit is not the problem. And in fact, the more information that people get that conflict with their own points of view, the stronger their reaction to the cognitive dissonance becomes. So if I am seeing information that doesn't conform with my point of view, cognitive dissonance sets in. So I have to either change my ideas and behaviors, which is the toughest one. I can rationalize what I think. I can go out and accept more information that agrees with my point of view, or I can ignore the other party. Those are the four different ways that we can deal with it. And right now, because we are in a conflict environment, people are shutting off the other point of view or seeking additional information to reinforce their opinions. If you take something, Rick, like the current controversial so-called documentary Plandemic, so the pandemic goes up, And we'll take again an idea of truth. Social media platforms see it, they believe that it contains misinformation and take it down. That's a truth. Now,
And so
what in,
YouTube has taken it down, and also it isn't Facebook also deleting that when somebody posts one of the archived
yes,
copies of the video?
yeah, it's a bit of a whack-a-mole though, because so many now copies of it exist that every time it goes down, someone else puts it up. But the idea that the social media platforms have taken the original copies down and continue to pursue it is true. So if you are on the side of saying that the pandemic video is propaganda, you're saying, well, that's proof because it's being taken down. But if you're on the other side who supports the views, you say this is a form of censorship. And it's actually proof that it's true because the powers that be want this taken down. To go to your question though, the only way that we're going to solve this is not by more information, but actually by trying to help people understand that we're in a constant state of being manipulated. The example that I like to give is that in the late 1900s, like 1998, 1999, um, a campaign was devised called The Truth. And The Truth was going to be a new campaign to try to persuade young people that smoking was not a good idea, to not start smoking. All of the efforts to do that in the previous 20 or 30 years were total failures. And for the most part, they were all about educating why smoking is bad for you. Smoking is bad for you. But the people who were behind the truth were smarter than that. And they realized that in order to connect with young people, they were going to have to latch onto ideas that they found as objectionable as we find smoking itself. So what they latched onto was the idea that big tobacco was manipulating you. Big tobacco was getting you to buy their products, and big tobacco was lying to you. And that created a different kind of dissonance. Instead of smoking is bad for you and you shouldn't do it, when in fact I saw my friends smoking, this was like a different idea. And well, as a result, smoking among young people went from, I think the figures are something like 23.8% in 1998. And the last study I saw in 2018 it was down below 7%. And so I think the same kind of thing has to happen. And I think the social media platforms, instead of trying to be, gatekeepers because they can't move as fast as people posting information, need to do a much better job of being able to explain through the views and not an antagonistic view, um, that their platforms are also sources of manipulating all of us. And it's only at that point when we get to that recognition that we can start to shift back from pure emotion back into reason. And we can also, if you again think of the triangle that Aristotle devised, is the ethos or the character of the source also has to be considered. And right now that's also being weaponized because one of the ways to win an argument is to bring down the character of the other person, right? And we
Yeah.
see that constantly. So we like to think, especially working in the classroom, that reason is the most important part of that triangle. But in fact, if you can heighten people's emotions and tear down the ethos of the other side's character, it creates an entirely different environment for information. One, in fact, that pushes reason off to the side, and that's the most dangerous part of all. So we have to find ways that are non-conflict to re-engage reason. And I think one of the universal feelings people have, Rick, is that I don't want to be manipulated. I don't want to be controlled. Wait a minute, what are people doing to me? And so that's an effort that if the smoking campaign took 20 years, this also could take 5, 10, 15 years to be able to do. But the bad actors on social media are far more clever than the good ones. And right now that balance is out of whack. The balance is way out of whack.
Right. So, I mean, some of these posts and videos and so forth, I watch them, the ones that I feel to be obviously false. You watch it, and if you study this at all, you see the manipulative techniques at work, right? And so you see it and you have an initial reaction, but I also understand that a lot of people aren't studying those techniques, right? And so
No.
the question is it better to have a policy where, say, YouTube and Facebook and other social media outlets, they censor those because they are manipulative, right, and very effective. They spread very quickly.
Hugely.
Or is it better to let them get out and see the light of day? Because this is what John Stuart Mill said, right, in his essay on liberty, was like the best way to counter falsehood is let it see the light of day, because then you expose it. If you try to hide it, it gains another kind of life.
Yeah, I think so. And what you're also seeing with something like Plandemic, Rick, is that by censoring, you actually give strength to the other party's point of view. The censoring itself brings credibility to the idea that powers that be are trying to shut us down or try to keep this message from getting out. There was a statistic that I read over the weekend. Again, all of this is driven by a financial incentive. The more likes and followers and clicks that I can get, especially on YouTube, the more money I can generate. But one YouTuber that had something along the lines of 4,500 or 5,000 subscribers went to 245,000 subscribers in less than 30 days by getting behind Plandemic. And so this idea now that this has been censored actually creates even, you know, a greater galvanizing effect for individuals who believe in this message. And if you think about Mill, I mean, he was a reason. I mean, he came from the age of reason,
Right.
and so he also was talking about this in terms of a level playing field and an exchange of ideas. And Mill, as the one of the founders or fathers of utilitarianism, we're always measuring things in very empirical terms. It was a very reasonable, logical system. There wasn't a way to quickly and pervasively weaponize emotion during that period of time as there is today. There's always been a way to engage emotion, but never with the speed or the intensity or the breadth that social media allows, to be able to do it in hours, to be able to do it in days. And so when I think about Mill, I think that the foundation is absolutely right, that we shouldn't censor, that we should educate instead and try to be able to get across the idea of how people can be manipulated. But I think his reasoning, needs to be looked at a little differently in this century and in this time period, because it's so much easier to amplify, elevate, and really spread things through emotion that could never have been done in the 1800s.
Yeah. Well, I guess the argument then against Mill is that if we're not operating rationally, if we're not bringing logos into our evaluation of these sorts of posts, then the only way to stop lies from spreading is to censor it, right?
It may very well be. I mean, it's an important conversation. I mean, when you think about Mill too, or at least what I know of Mill, keep in mind I'm the accidental ethicist here. I'm not the educated one. But it seems, again, based in these foundations of reason. But there are different ways to use communication other than information. So when I think about Mill, it's like, okay, two pieces of information, let's have it out and let the best argue. It's a follow-up to me of Socratic dialogue. It's allow the best one to come to the light. Two different things, though. What we think of the best now often involves what is the most popular. What is the most popular often wins the debate, because everything's become a conflict. Even on TV, things have to become conflicts or combats. But secondarily, that there are more ways to communicate than through information. So I can denigrate, I can spread misinformation, I can attack your ethos, I can increase your emotion. So therefore, Mill isn't just talking about information. All of a sudden, all these other factors have weight. And in fact, in my opinion, they often have more weight in these debates. I think that um, I think that's a big difference from his time.
Well, this is a great conversation, Frank. I want to wrap it up by just
Of
talking
course.
a little bit about, I want to just ask you a little bit about teaching young people and your thought about the future, because when I'm teaching ethics and, teaching critical thinking and how to make better decisions, but part of that is also having the self-knowledge of when am I being manipulated from the
Exactly.
outside. Like, what sources do I look for? What kind of characteristics do I look for in good reasoning as opposed to bad reasoning? I find that the young people I'm teaching are really interested in this. And I'm heartened by that. It makes me optimistic about going forward, that we have young people who seem to be pretty much really aware of the ways in which they're being manipulated by these new technologies, and wanting to have tools to kind of, I would say, preserve their own and preserve societal integrity. So for you, you're teaching in a much bigger city, and you're teaching specifically communication ethics. So what is your impression of working with young people right now?
We might be in different cities and different parts of the country, Rick, but our experiences are very much the same. So yeah, I think that your introduction is also part of the solution. And if you take it relative to something like the Truth Campaign and tobacco that I talked about, the efforts to be able to communicate and work with young people about these issues and challenges and potential threats to their individuality is how we eventually change things. So, one of the interesting things when I started teaching communications ethics 5 years ago was the question was often, well, why do we even need that? What, why do you need that? What, I get kind of puzzled looks. That doesn't even make sense. But now we're aware of it. So this is our opportunity. This is our opportunity through education, starting with younger people who are also, really averse to the fact that they're getting dealt, not the very best hand in life right now. So they don't trust a lot of institutions, and they don't trust the fact that they could be manipulated in the same way as tobacco did. And so to be able to open up their minds, to be able to separate emotion from reason, to help them understand that this is just part of being human. I think one of the most important parts of my class is the emphasis that this isn't anything that you're doing wrong or that other people are doing wrong. It's a result of being human. That we can switch from our fast thinking mode to a slow thinking mode, and to begin to employ more reason. Um, I th- I think we're going to have a lot better impact over the years, Rick, doing that than we are going to be trying to change the minds of people who already have very rigid mindsets.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Frank. I appreciate this discussion. It's really interesting, in some ways kind of discouraging, but I guess that's why we both get to teach ethics, because there's a lot of work to do. So
I think that the encouraging thing, and you probably see the same thing, is that once students see that ethics isn't a book of rules, but it's actually a decision-making tool set that gives me power and allows me to have more voice and more control, it's an exciting thing. And I think that anyone who has really been turned on in my classroom by that concept also sees the power. And for them, it means, career power as well, because these issues in communications relative to digital media and persuasion are only going to increase, especially especially with the advent of artificial intelligence and the ability to program all of this bad acting. It doesn't even have to be done by the hands of humans. They realize that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, these skill sets are going to put them ahead of other people. So it's a turning point for us too, just in spreading the word of ethics. So I appreciate the opportunity to do that here.
Well, thank you, Frank. And I'm thinking that, once the election campaign here really ramps up and we go into late summer and fall, I might want to contact you again and have another discussion about just the ethics of campaigning and what we're seeing with communications in the campaigns, because like this responsibility of citizens to get correct information gets even harder in the midst of all the targeting of these campaign ads, especially on social media.
Rick, it would be my pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me to do this today. It was great to meet you a few years back, and it's an even greater pleasure that we can continue this relationship.
Well, it's mutual. Thanks so much, Frank.
Thank you, Rick. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.